My son-in-law thought he could barge into my home with his friends, but my dead wife still owns it. The Halloween party in memory of Eleanor had now become Mark's private stage. Among his son-in-law's wealthy friends, Richard overheard a conversation that left him speechless. "Honey, we're going to have to take down this old wall sooner or later," Mark said to Chloe, pointing to Richard's lifelong architectural designs. "Mark, I'm right there." Chloe hesitated. Richard stepped forward, his voice eerily calm. "This old wall paid for your first car, Mark. And my tuition?" Chloe quickly defended herself. "Dad, he was just kidding. Why are you making such a big deal out of it?" Richard looked straight at his daughter. "Because I'm watching you let your husband destroy me in my own house. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening?" The scent of scorched pumpkin and cinnamon hung in the air, a ghost of Halloween's past. Richard ran a thumb over the smooth, cool skin of a final pumpkin, its triangular eyes carved and waiting for a candle's soul. This was Eleanor's holiday. She had been the one to transform a night of teenage mischief into an annual pilgrimage for their friends and family, a bastion of warmth against the encroaching autumn chill. His large craftsman-style house, with its dirty oak furniture he designed himself, and the great stone fireplace that was its heart, always felt most alive on this night. He was merely the custodian of the tradition now, the quiet tender of a flame she had lit. He placed the pumpkin on the porch railing next to his grinning brethren, a silent orange choir. As he did, a sleek black Audi Q7 pulled into the driveway, its headlights slicing through the dusk. The king and queen had arrived. Mark burst from the driver's side, already talking on his phone, his voice a booming proclamation of some recent victory in the stock market. Chloe emerged more gracefully from the passenger side, a whisper of expensive perfume trailing behind her. She was beautiful, his daughter, a polished, brighter version of her mother. She hurried toward him, arms outstretched. "Dad, it looks amazing," she said, her hug a fleeting, papery thing. It was a performance for an unseen audience, a checking of a box. Her eyes were already scanning the living room behind him, assessing the party's potential, not her father's face. Mark ended his call with a triumphant laugh and clapped Richard on the shoulder. "Richard, my man, ready to get this party started?" He didn't wait for an answer, already striding into the house as if he owned it. In a way, Richard thought with a familiar, dull ache, he was starting to. The house filled quickly. The old crowd, Richard's neighbors and colleagues, people who had known Eleanor, was soon outnumbered by Mark's coterie, a loud, glossy collection of financial advisors and their immaculately groomed wives. Richard watched from the periphery as Mark and Chloe moved through the room, a unit of effortless social grace. Anxious pride swelled in his chest. His daughter was a natural host, a magnetic center of gravity. Then he saw it. The first crack in the perfect wall of the evening. Mark was directing two of his friends, gesturing expensively. He wanted more space for a large, portable Sonos speaker that was currently blasting a generic playlist of pop hits. To make room, he unceremoniously grabbed Richard's favorite leather armchair, Eleanor's chair, and began dragging it toward the hallway. It was the chair she had always sat in, curled up with a book, its leather softened and worn in the precise shape of her. The sight of it being moved so casually was a physical blow. Richard moved toward them, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "Mark, that chair has sentimental value." Mark didn't even let him finish. He let go of the chair for a moment to sling a familiar, patronizing arm around Richard's shoulders, his laugh so loud it was a show for his friends. "Come on, Richard, times are changing. We need space for a dance floor, not a sitting room from a nursing home." His friends chuckled obligingly. The laughter drowned out Richard's protest, rendering it insignificant. The foolish sentiment of an old man. Mark gave his shoulder a final, dismissive pat and shoved the chair the rest of the way into the dimly lit hall. A possession displaced. Later, the crack widened. Mark was giving a tour, a proud peacock showing off a property he was poised to inherit. He'd gathered a wealthy-looking couple, potential investors for his latest venture, and led them to the wall in Richard's study. It was a gallery wall, showcasing the architectural designs that had defined Richard's career, the winery in Napa, the library in Oregon, the beachfront home in Carmel that had won him the award. It was the story of his life, told in blueprints and elegant, clean lines. Amazing, Richard. Did you design all these structures? The male guest asked, his interest genuine. A flicker of the old pride ignited in Richard's chest. He stepped forward, ready to share the stories behind the frames. Yes, this project in Napa is one of the... Yep, my father-in-law was a big shot back in the day, Mark interrupted, smoothly cutting him off and draping an arm around the guest. He leaned in conspiratorially, but he's retired now, of course, full-time grandpa duty. Chloe and I have actually been talking about modernizing this space a bit. He gestured vaguely at the wall of Richard's life's work. Maybe replace this whole old-fashioned wall with a single, massive piece of contemporary art. Something with a bit more impact. He said, old-fashioned with a wink, as if he and the guest were sharing a private joke at the expense of the relic standing beside them. The guest offered Richard a tight, uncomfortable smile. Richard said nothing. He simply stood there as his legacy was assessed, devalued, and scheduled for demolition. He felt himself shrinking, becoming a museum piece in his own home, a quaint artifact to be explained away. He was no longer the host. He was part of the house tour. From across the room, he caught the eye of his neighbor, Sarah. She'd known Eleanor since college. She was holding a glass of wine. Her conversation paused, and on her face was a look of profound, troubled sympathy. She'd seen it. She'd heard it. He wasn't the only one. His silence, he realized, born from a desperate need to protect Chloe's happiness and keep the peace, was being misinterpreted. It wasn't seen as love, but as weakness. A green light, he began to ask himself the question he'd been avoiding for months. Is protecting harmony worth sacrificing his own dignity? The party raged on, a sea of noise and hollow laughter. Richard eventually retreated to his study, the one space that still felt entirely his. He stood by the window, looking out at the pulsing, alien gathering that had taken over his home. He wasn't angry. He was just observing, collecting data. A soft knock came at the door. It was Chloe. Dad, come on out. You're missing the fun. Mark has a brilliant idea for the party. She was smiling, her face flushed with wine and excitement, oblivious to the cracks, spiderwebbing across the foundation of her childhood home. He wants to do a seance. Ended Farouk. Richard's gaze drifted from his daughter's bright, blind face to the silver-framed photograph of Eleanor on his desk. He looked at his wife's warm, intelligent eyes and then back at the daughter they had raised. His own eyes sharpened, a cold, clear focus settling in where the fog of grief and nostalgia had once been. A seance in Eleanor's house. The architect in him saw the flaw in the design, the critical point of stress, and for the first time that night, he felt the urge to build not a house, but a wall of his own. Richard initially had no intention of joining. He watched from the doorway as Mark, with the air of a Vegas magician, cleared the center of the walnut dining table. It was the table Richard had built for Eleanor on their 20th anniversary, its surface polished to a mirror shine over decades of family dinners. On top of this sacred piece of their history, Mark placed a cheap cardboard Ouija board from Target, its garish illustrations a desecration of the fine-grained wood. Dad, come on, don't spoil the fun, Chloe called to him, her voice tinged with a slight impatience he was beginning to recognize. It was the voice she used when she was managing him, steering him toward compliance with Mark's agenda. His first instinct was to refuse, to remain in the study, a silent protest. But then he looked at Mark, puffed up and preening for his audience, and a different instinct took over. This was not a game to be avoided. It was a field of battle. Reluctantly, as if indulging a childish whim, he walked toward the table and took a seat. His agreement was not an indulgence. It was an enlistment. The group gathered, Mark's friends pulling chairs up with giddy, ironic detachment. This wasn't a genuine seance. It was an act of camp, a trendy mockery of an old tradition. A friend of Mark's, a slick real estate developer named Todd, was appointed the sidekick. As they settled in, Mark reached for the Ouija board's planchette, knocking over a crystal vase of white daisies, Eleanor's favorite, that sat in the center of the table. Water pooled and began to seep into the wood. Mark, watch out. Dad's table, Chloe began, a flicker of genuine alarm in her eyes. Mark just laughed. A loud, dismissive bark. He sloppily wiped at the spill with the sleeve of his cashmere sweater. Come on, honey. It's just a little water. Surely Mom's spirit won't mind. He shot the words directly at Richard, a glinting, deliberate challenge in his eyes. He had crossed the line, moving from casual disrespect to outright blasphemy. In that moment, Richard's pain didn't deepen. It calcified. It transformed into a cold, hard clarity. He was no longer looking at his daughter's husband. He was looking at an architectural problem, a poorly designed, arrogant structure, about to collapse under its own weight. Todd, the sidekick, began the charade, his voice a low, dramatic parody. I am sensing a presence, a powerful female energy. Oh, that'll be Eleanor, Mark cut in, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Ask her if she's got any stock tips. Is Tesla going up or down next week? His friends roared with laughter. Richard glanced across the table and saw Sarah Gable, his neighbor, shake her head with a look of quiet disgust. An awkward silence fell over the older guests, a clear divide between those who found this amusing and those who found it appalling. No, let's be serious for a minute, Todd said, playing his part. He closed his eyes. I'm getting questioned for the daughter. She wants to know if you're happy, Chloe. All eyes turned to his daughter. Chloe, caught between two worlds, gave a small, nervous laugh. Oh, God. She looked at Mark, then at his friends, desperate for their approval. My mother would say this stuff is absolutely silly. She was very practical. It was another betrayal, a small but sharp twisting of the knife. She was disowning her own past to fit into her husband's shiny, shallow present. She had chosen her side. Richard remained silent, his hands resting in his lap. He was no longer a passive observer, but a strategist, assessing his opponent's weaknesses. And Mark's greatest weakness was his bottomless vanity. He was drunk on the power he felt in this house, the need not just to occupy its physical space, but to conquer its memories, to mock its ghosts. Fueled by the laughter and the expensive scotch in his glass, Mark leaned forward, placing his hands theatrically on the board. He was ready for his grand finale. He wanted to solidify his victory, to claim his prize in front of everyone. He laughed again, a sound that filled the entire room, blotting out everything else. Okay, if Eleanor is really here, I've got the only question that matters. He looked directly at Richard, a triumphant, defiant smirk spreading across his face. The room fell silent. Hey, Eleanor, he boomed. Tell everyone who owns this house now. The silence that followed Mark's question was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the party's cheerful buzz. Guests froze with glasses halfway to their lips. Mark's friends wore smirks of gleeful anticipation, eager to see the old man finally put in his place. Across the table, Richard saw Sarah Gable's face tighten with a pained empathy. She, and others of her generation in the room, looked down at their plates, unable to watch the public execution of a man's dignity. Mark, mistaking the tense quiet for a victory lap, let out a triumphant laugh. What's the matter, Richard? Cat got your tongue? Or is Eleanor's spirit having trouble getting a word in? He was high on his own audacity, a performer who had captivated his audience. He turned to Chloe, pulling her into the spotlight with him. Honey, tell your dad, it's okay. We've already spoken with the lawyer. It's all just a formality, but technically, this house will be ours soon enough. Chloe shifted uncomfortably, a flush creeping up her neck. She was caught in the crossfire, and as always, she chose the path of least resistance. Mark, don't be like that, she chided weakly, before turning to her father with a placating smile. Dad, it's just a formality, for tax purposes. Nothing will change. Nothing will change. The words hung in the air, a spectacular misreading of the room, of the entire evening. Richard hadn't moved. He hadn't looked away from Mark. His expression was one of serene, almost clinical observation. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through Mark's boisterous noise like a scalpel. That's not for me to decide, Mark. The simplicity of the statement was disarming. Mark's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. Oh, really? Then who? The ghost of Christmas past? Eleanor, Richard said, his voice perfectly even. She decided long ago. For the first time, a genuine ripple of confusion went through Mark's entourage. This was not in the script. Mark's smile was still there, but it was now a brittle, forced thing. Right. My dead mother-in-law, who's been gone for 2 years, is going to settle a property dispute. That's rich. Ang Nayazai. Richard remembered a conversation on the porch years ago, not long after Chloe and Mark were engaged. Eleanor had been watching Mark hold court with some of their friends. He loves our Chloe, Ricky, she had said quietly, her insight as sharp as ever. But he loves what she represents more. He sees success as a zero-sum game. She had a way of seeing the structural flaws in people. That conversation was why her final backup plan, her test from the grave, existed at all. Richard's gaze was unwavering as he looked straight into his son-in-law's eyes. Just wait and see. And then he moved. The scrape of his chair against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the dead silent room. He stood up, a man no longer a victim, but the director of the scene. The power in the room, which had pulled around the loudest voice, now swung silently, inexorably, to the calmest man. Richard turned and began walking toward his study. Every eye followed him. The short journey from the dining room to the study door felt like a procession. His steps were measured, deliberate. He wasn't storming off in a huff. He was leading them somewhere. He entered the study and went to the large, built-in bookshelf he had designed. With a practiced movement, he swung a section of books outward, revealing the dull gray face of a wall safe. The collective intake of breath from the doorway was audible. Mark stood frozen by the dining table, that confident smirk completely gone, replaced by a tight-lipped mask of confusion and the flicker of something he would never admit to, unease. He was beginning to realize that Richard's calm was not resignation. Chloe looked pale, her eyes wide, darting between her husband and the doorway to her father's study. This game, this cruel Halloween prank, had suddenly become very real. Richard placed his fingers on the combination dial. The room held its breath, waiting. The question was no longer about a ghost's opinion. It was about what lay behind that steel door. Was this some elaborate, pathetic trick? Or had Eleanor, the quiet, observant woman they all thought they knew, just dealt her final hand from beyond the grave? The clicks of the safe's dial were like heartbeats in the dead, still room. Richard's movements were slow, deliberate, each turn of the knob a small, precise ritual. Everyone in the doorway leaned in, a silent, captive audience. The metallic thud of the bolt releasing was unnervingly loud. Richard swung the heavy steel door open. He reached inside and withdrew not a single flimsy envelope, but a thick, professionally bound document. Its cover emblazoned with the name of a prestigious law firm in San Francisco. Alongside it was a smaller, cream-colored envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, addressed in Eleanor's elegant, familiar script. He walked back to the dining table and placed both items upon the polished walnut surface, the irrefutable evidence. Mark stared at the legal document, his face ashen. The swagger had evaporated, leaving behind a brittle, panicked confusion. He was a gambler who had just seen the house reveal a card he never knew was in the deck. Richard let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the objects to press down on the room. Then he looked at his daughter, his expression softening with a profound, aching sadness. "Before I read this," he said, gesturing to the letter, "there's something you need to know, Chloe. Something your mother made me and Mark promise never to tell you." At the mention of his name, Mark's head snapped up, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. "You'll remember, about 10 years ago," Richard began, his voice a low, steady current of memory. Mark's first tech startup was on the verge of bankruptcy. He was about to lose everything. Chloe nodded slowly, a vague recollection. It was a time Mark never talked about, a blip he'd glossed over in the triumphant story of his success. "He came to us," Richard continued. "He needed a significant investment, and no bank would touch him. So your mother, without a moment's hesitation, quietly sold the entire portfolio of blue chip stocks her father had left her. It was her inheritance. Her safety net. A brief, wordless image flashed in Richard's mind. Eleanor in the lawyer's office, her face calm but resolute as she signed the papers, transferring her past into Mark's future. She asked Mark and me to keep it a secret, Richard said, his gaze now locking onto his son-in-law. She said, I don't want Chloe to feel like she owes me anything. Her only condition was a promise. She told you, didn't she, Mark? This money is not a gift. It's an investment in our family. Promise me you'll always cherish what it builds. Richard paused, letting the words fill every corner of the room. And tonight, he said, his voice dropping, each word a perfectly placed stone, at this very table, bought with that money, in this house she loved, you spilled water on her memory and joked about her spirit. You stood here and demanded to know who owned this house. He looked directly at Mark, the quiet architect, suddenly a formidable prosecutor. Mark, Eleanor answered that question 10 years ago. She did. She bought it, all of it, with her own sacrifice. A choked sob broke from Chloe. She covered her mouth with both hands, her body shaking. The casual cruelties of the evening, Mark's dismissiveness, his arrogance, all snapped into a horrifying new focus. She looked at her husband, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she did not see the ambitious, charming man she loved. She saw a stranger, a desecrator, standing on holy ground he had not earned. She began to re-examine every joke at her family's expense, every boast, seeing them not as confidence but as the twisted truths of a man who knew he was a fraud. Mark was completely passive, trapped in the clique light of the truth. He couldn't deny it. His entire career, the sleek black Audi in the driveway, the expensive watch on his wrist, it was all built on the foundation of the woman he had just mocked. With the moral verdict rendered, and the room now a silent, stunned courtroom, Richard finally picked up the yellowed, cream-colored envelope. He held it for a moment, his thumb tracing the familiar curves of his wife's handwriting. The whole party, friends and strangers alike, held its collective breath. The only question left was, what had Eleanor written? What was the final judgment? Richard unfolded the single sheet of cream-colored paper. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. He cleared his throat, and in a voice steady and clear, he began to read. To whom it may concern, should it ever become necessary, he began. The words were Eleanor's, but the voice was now an instrument of her will. This house, at 142 Sycamore Lane, was purchased with my personal inheritance. It was, is, and always will be, legally and morally mine. It is the heart of my family, a sanctuary built on love and mutual respect. I have always believed that character is revealed not in grand gestures, but in small moments of gratitude or carelessness. Richard paused, his eyes lifting from the page to find Mark. I have seen the rod of ingratitude. I have seen how ambition can curdle a man's soul. This letter is my final failsafe. It is to be opened only if the sanctuary of this house is violated by the very man I invested in. All the band hate to want to. The air crackled. Every person in the room understood. Richard's voice grew stronger, imbued with a righteous finality, as he read the last two sentences, written in a slightly firmer hand, underlined twice. Mark Jenkins, you are no longer welcome here. Get out. The words landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the room. Mark's face, which had been pale, was now a mask of crimson rage and disbelief. The illusion of his power shattered in an instant. This is a trick. You faked it! He roared, lunging across the table, his hand outstretched to snatch the letter. Richard didn't flinch. He simply placed his hand flat on the thick, legally bound document next to the letter. It was witnessed and notarized by Eleanor's lawyer, Mark. As is this addendum, he tapped the cover of the document. There's a clause, a breach of trust clause. Should you ever act in a manner that desecrates the family's honor, which I believe a dozen witnesses can attest happened here tonight, you are legally obligated to repay Eleanor's initial investment, in full, with 10 years of compounded interest. Richard looked at him, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating pity. You've ruined yourself, financially, socially, and morally bankrupt. In the space of 3 minutes, Mark stood there, panting, his last desperate gambit neutralized. He turned, his eyes wild, searching for an ally, for his wife. "Chloe, baby, say something. Tell him we're a family," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Chloe had stopped crying. She stood up, her face tear-streaked, but her eyes as cold and clear as ice. She looked at the man she had married, the man she had enabled, and saw him for exactly what he was. The cracks hadn't just broken open. The entire facade had been demolished. "My family," she said, her voice low and shaking with a strength she didn't know she possessed, "does not blaspheme the dead." She took a deep breath. "Get out." It was the final, fatal blow. There was nowhere left for him to turn. Silently, under the weight of 24 pairs of eyes, Mark walked to the hall closet and retrieved his coat. His friends, the ones who had laughed at his jokes just an hour before, suddenly found the pattern on the Persian rug intensely fascinating. Not a single person met his gaze. He fumbled for his keys, the jangling sound unnaturally loud in the silence, and walked out the front door without a word, closing it softly behind him. The spell was broken. The party was over. The guests, Marks and Reachers alike, began to murmur their apologies and make their quiet exits, leaving hushed condolences as if they were departing a funeral. Soon, only Richard and Chloe were left, standing in the living room that was once again theirs. The scent of cinnamon and pumpkin remained. A half-eaten plate of food sat on a side table. The silence was no longer tense, but peaceful, cleansed. Richard walked over to his daughter. He didn't say a word, just gently placed his hand on her shoulder. She leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of the ruin, but also of the truth. Their relationship had been fractured, strained to the breaking point, but it had not been built on a lie. And now, on the solid ground of Eleanor's legacy, they could begin to rebuild. The soft click of the front door closing behind the last departing guest echoed in the cavernous silence of the living room. The party hadn't so much ended as evaporated, its energy sucked out of the room the moment Eleanor's letter was read. In its place, a thick, suffocating awkwardness had descended. Mark's friends had been the first to flee. A herd of sleek, well-dressed animals, startled by a predator they hadn't known was in their midst. They offered Chloe mumbled, incoherent phrases as they scurried out. Chloe, we've got to get going." The sitter, one of Mark's partners, had stammered, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over her left shoulder. "If you need anything, just call." The offer hung in the air, empty and useless, a social reflex devoid of any real meaning. They couldn't get away fast enough. Their hasty departure was a judgment in itself, a silent excommunication. The older guests, Richard's friends, had lingered a moment longer. Their goodbyes were quiet, freighted with a sorrowful understanding. Sarah Gable, his neighbor, had walked past Richard on her way out. She said nothing at all, simply reached out and placed her hand on his forearm for a brief, firm second. That simple, warm pressure conveyed everything. Sympathy for his pain, vindication for his stand, and a deep, unspoken judgment on the daughter who had allowed this desecration to happen under her father's roof. It was a gesture of solidarity that almost broke him. Now, they were alone. Richard and Chloe stood amidst the ruins of the evening. The living room, which hours before had been a testament to Eleanor's warmth and hospitality, now looked like a crime scene. A half-empty glass of scotch sat condensing on the mantelpiece. A dish of expensive canapes lay untouched. And on the center of the walnut dining table, a monument to the evening's folly, sat the cheap cardboard Ouija board. The silence between father and daughter was heavier and more profound than the collective quiet of the departing crowd. It was a silence filled with years of things unsaid, of truths ignored and loyalties betrayed. Richard felt a hollow ache in his chest. The sharp, satisfying tongue of victory had dissolved, leaving behind the bitter taste of its cost. He had won. He had protected his wife's honor and reclaimed his home. But he looked at his daughter, standing limp and shattered by the fireplace, and felt the immense, devastating weight of his prize. It was Chloe who finally broke the silence. Her voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible. "How long have you known?" It was the right question. She wasn't asking about the letter. She was asking about Mark. She was asking how long her father had been watching her live a lie. Richard didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the armchair, Eleanor's chair, that Mark had so carelessly shoved into the hall and slowly, deliberately dragged it back to its rightful place by the fire. He sank into its worn leather, the familiar contours a small comfort in the wreckage. I didn't know anything, Chloe, he said, his voice weary. I just saw. He didn't need to accuse, he only needed to bear witness. I saw the way he talked over you when you were telling a story about your work. I saw the way his eyes would scan the room for someone more important when you were speaking to him. I saw the way he laughed at that silly nickname your college friends still call you. They weren't jokes. They were little assertions of ownership. Little cracks in the foundation, if you have to. He recounted the small, seemingly insignificant moments she had so expertly ignored. The time Mark had forgotten to mention a major award Reacher had won at a dinner party. The way he casually referred to Eleanor's carefully tended garden as a good spot for a pool. Each memory was a small, sharp stone, and he laid them out one by one, not as an indictment, but as a simple, painful statement of fact. With each word, Chloe seemed to shrink. The truth, now that it was finally allowed into the room, was a brutal, relentless force. When he finished, she made a sound, a low, guttural noise of pure anguish, and collapsed onto the sofa. The tears that came were not the panicked, self-pitying tears he had seen earlier. These were the deep, scalding tears of atonement. I was so blind, she sobbed, her words muffled by her hands. Or I chose to be. It was easier. Everyone loved him. He was so successful, so charming. I thought his confidence was what I needed. She looked up at him, her face a mess of mascara and regret. I let him turn me into someone else. Someone who would laugh at those jokes. Someone who would stand by and let him do that. Her gesture took in the Ouija board, the displaced flowers, the entire sacrilegious evening. Richard's heart broke for her, for the years she had lost, for the person she had suppressed. The cold strategist who had orchestrated the night's checkmate was gone, replaced by the father who had once taught this weeping woman how to ride a bicycle. He knew that words like, I forgive you or it's okay, were useless now. They were plasters for a wound that needed to be cleaned and stitched. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He stood up, walked into the quiet of the kitchen, and filled the kettle with water. He took down 2 mugs from the cupboard, Eleanor's favorites, a matching pair with fading bluebells painted on them. He found a box of Earl Grey tea and waited for the whistle of the kettle, a sound that was the very essence of home, of comfort, of things being put right. It was what Eleanor would have done. It was a small, simple act of care in the face of an immense and complicated pain. He carried the steaming mugs back into the living room and placed one on the small table beside his daughter. The fragrant steam rose between them. He sat back down in his chair, the warmth of the mug seeping into his hands. Winning the battle against Mark had been the easy part. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the real work helping his daughter find her way back to herself was just beginning. Chloe reached for the cup, her hands still trembling. She looked up at him through swollen, red-rimmed eyes, the question in them no longer about her husband, but about the woman whose ghost had presided over the evening. Dad? She whispered, her voice fragile. That letter, when did Mom write it? I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking. Like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? The question hung in the quiet room, a fragile thread of curiosity in the dense fabric of grief and regret. That letter, when did Mom write it? Richard looked down into the depths of his tea, as if the story were steeped in the amber liquid. He had replayed the memory 1,000 times, a private, sacred film he never intended to screen. But Chloe needed to see it now. She needed to understand that the night's verdict was not an act of vengeance, but a final, desperate act of protection. It was almost 10 years ago, he began, his voice soft, drifting back in time. Just a few weeks after she gave Mark the money, his company had its first small success. A new contract, a bit of good press. He was ecstatic, on top of the world. To celebrate, He took us all out to dinner at that ridiculously expensive Italian place downtown, Fior d'Italia. You remember the one? With the white tablecloths so stiff they could stand on their own. Chloe nodded, a flicker of a memory in her eyes. We were all so happy that night, Richard continued, a profound sadness coloring his tone. So relieved. We felt like we'd done the right thing. We'd bet on family, and it felt like the bet was paying off. Your mother was glowing. She was so proud, not of the money, but of seeing you happy, seeing a future for you both that felt secure. He painted the scene for her, the clinking of wine glasses, the scent of truffle and garlic, Mark holding court at the table, his voice booming with a newfound confidence that they all mistook for strength, and Eleanor sitting beside him, smiling that genuine, crinkle-eyed smile that lit up her whole face. We were just finishing our main course when a man came over to our table, Richard said. An older gentleman, very distinguished. Turns out he was a potential investor. Mark had been courting a big name in Silicon Valley. He clapped Mark on the shoulder, full of congratulations. Richard paused, preparing himself for the crucial scene, the tiny, almost invisible moment where everything had changed. He looked at Chloe, making sure she was listening, truly listening. The investor said to him, "Mark, congratulations. I heard you turned the company around on your own. What an inspiring self-made story." Richard let the man's words hang in the air between them. Chloe's brow furrowed slightly, sensing the importance of what was coming. And Mark, he just beamed. He stood up, shook the man's hand, and said, "Thank you, sir." Yes, it was a lot of sleepless nights and sheer force of will. He didn't hesitate. He didn't say, "Well, I was lucky to have incredible support from my family." He didn't even glance at your mother. He just took it, all of it. He erased her from the story of his own creation. Richard watched Chloe's face as the implication landed. It was a quiet, insidious act of betrayal, far more revealing than a screaming fight or a grand transgression. "Your mother," Richard said, his voice thick with the memory. She didn't flinch. She just sat there, smiling politely at the investor. But I was watching her, and I saw it. I saw the light go out in her eyes. It was like a shutter closing. In that single, selfish moment, she saw the real man she had invested in, and it broke her heart. The car ride home that night had been silent. Chloe, oblivious, had been chattering happily about the meal. But later, after she had gone to bed, Richard found Eleanor standing by the window in their bedroom, looking out into the dark garden. "I asked her if she was okay," Richard recounted, "and she turned to me, her face so calm it was chilling. She said, 'I don't need his thanks, Ricky. I never did, but I needed him to be honest. A man who is dishonest about his origins will be dishonest about everything else. He doesn't see our family as a foundation. He sees it as a ladder, and he will kick away any rung he no longer needs." The next day, Eleanor had an appointment. She told Richard she was going to the nursery to buy some new hydrangeas. Instead, she went to her lawyer's office. Alone, she came home that evening and told me what she'd done, Richard said. She'd had the lawyer draft a codicil to her will, legally affirming her sole ownership of the house, and she wrote that letter. She told me she was putting them in the safe. She called them her safety pin. I just stayed. He remembered her exact words, the practicality of her metaphor so quintessentially Eleanor. "It's an insurance policy, Ricky," she'd said. "For Chloe, a safety pin. You hope you never have to use it, that the strap never breaks. But if it does, you are damn glad it's there to hold things together." She made me promise I would only ever use it if he proved himself to be the man she saw in that restaurant. A man who would try to erase her legacy. He fell silent. The story was told. The last piece of the puzzle was in place. It wasn't a document born of anger. It was a shield, forged with calm, heartbreaking foresight by a mother who had seen the fatal flaw in her daughter's future and had done the only thing she could to protect her from it. Chloe no longer felt the sharp sting of guilt. It had been replaced by a wave of profound, aching love and admiration for her mother. She finally understood. The signs had been there for a decade. She hadn't just been deceived by Mark. She had actively participated in her own deception, ignoring the small cracks because she was so desperate to believe in the perfect wall. Her mother hadn't judged her for it. She had simply prepared for the day it would inevitably crumble. She reached out and picked up the cream-colored envelope from the table. She read her mother's final, powerful words again, no longer as a verdict, but as a liberation. Her eyes, clear now, lifted from the page and met her father's. The tears were gone, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. "Dad," she said, her voice steady, "you need to do something." The morning after Halloween, the house was preternaturally quiet. The ghosts of the party had been exorcised, leaving behind only the scent of lemon polish and the profound silence of a space reclaimed. Chloe sat at the walnut dining table, a mug of tea cradled in her hands, her face pale but her eyes clear of the fog that had clouded them for years. Richard sat opposite her, not speaking, simply being present. The question she had asked, "What should you do?" had hung in the air all night. But as dawn broke, they both knew the question had changed. It was now, what should... "It's not enough that he's gone," Chloe said, her voice low but steady. She was no longer a victim processing trauma. She was a strategist surveying a battlefield. He didn't just disrespect Mom. He built his entire life, his entire reputation, on her, on us. That's the part that has to come down. Richard watched her, a deep, bitter pride swelling in his chest. He was heartbroken that his daughter had been forced into this war. But he was immensely proud of the strength she was finally claiming as her own. He had taught her how to build things with clean lines and structural integrity. Now, he would help her learn how to dismantle a structure built on lies. He nodded. "So, we take away the foundation." Their actions were not born of blind rage. They were precise, calculated, and executed with the cool detachment of a demolition crew. They didn't go to the press. They didn't file a police report. They did something far more effective. They turned the weapons of Mark's own world against him. Chloe spent an hour that afternoon at her laptop, Richard occasionally leaning over her shoulder to help her refine a phrase. The email she composed was a masterpiece of social warfare, disguised as a vulnerable, heartfelt confession. She sent it not to everyone, but to a carefully curated list of 6 women, the undisputed social hubs of their community, the gossip queens whose words carried more weight than any newspaper headline. The email was short. It detailed Eleanor's quiet sacrifice and Mark's public blasphemy at the party. It didn't rage or accuse. It concluded with a sentence of devastating power. "I wanted to share my story with a few close friends, not to spread gossip, but because telling the truth is a first step in my own healing process. I have to reclaim my family's narrative and my own." She hesitated for a long moment, her finger hovering over the mouse. This was the point of no return. She looked at her father, who gave her a single, affirming nod. She clicked send. At the same time, Richard made his own move. He sat at his mahogany desk in the study and drafted a brief, formal letter to his family lawyer. It was a simple instruction to begin the legal proceedings necessary to enforce the breach of trust clause in Eleanor's will and collect the full debt plus interest from Mark Jenkins. He printed it, signed it, and sealed it in an envelope. He then composed a quick email to Mark's primary business partner, a man named George Peterson. The subject line read, "Urgent legal matter." The body was simple. "George, I believe this was sent to you by mistake. Please disregard. My apologies. Richard." Attached was a scanned copy of the letter to his lawyer. An accidental leak, as clean and lethal as a drop of poison. They had lit the fuses. Now, they waited for the explosions. It didn't take long. The whisper started within hours. A text message to Chloe from a friend at her yoga studio. "Oh my God, Chloe, just heard. Are you okay? That is horrifying." Then another from the mother at her son's school, "Thinking of you. The man is a monster." The news spread through their privileged, interconnected world like wildfire through dry grass. It was the topic of hushed conversations over post-workout smoothies, the subject of urgent phone calls between tennis partners. Mark wasn't just a cheat or a jerk. He had committed the ultimate social sin in their world of old money and carefully curated legacies. He had desecrated the sanctity of family. He had mocked the hand that had not just fed him, but had made him. The first domino fell 2 days later. Richard received a phone call from Bill Hargrove, an old friend and a senior member at the Oak Creek Golf Club. the epicenter of Mark's social climbing. Rich, Bill said, his voice a mixture of embarrassment and awe. I don't even know what to say. This thing with Mark, it's everywhere. Nobody can talk about anything else. His photo is being taken down from the board candidate's wall as we speak. His campaign is over. Frankly, I don't think he'll ever be able to show his face in the clubhouse again. No one wants to be associated with a guy like that. Richard thanked him, his face betraying no emotion. He hung up the phone and looked at Chloe, who had been listening. A grim satisfaction settled between them. The social execution was complete. The second domino wobbled the next morning. Chloe's phone rang. It was an unknown number. She answered, putting it on speaker. Chloe? It's George Peterson. Mark's business partner sounded stressed, his voice tight. Listen, I received a disturbing email. I've been trying to reach Mark for 2 days. His phone goes straight to voicemail. I've called an emergency meeting with our investors. We need to know, is what Richard's letter implies true? Did Eleanor Bainbridge finance the seed money for our entire enterprise? Chloe's voice was calm and clear. Yes, George, every penny. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the sound of a man watching his own professional life flash before his eyes. My God, he finally breathed. His entire self-made narrative is what our brand is built on. He cleared his throat. Thank you for your honesty, Chloe. I have a lot of calls to make. He hung up. They both knew what that meant. The professional execution was in motion. Mark had lost his home, he had lost his wife. Now his social standing was obliterated, and his business, the monument he had built to his own ego on a foundation of Eleanor's money, was beginning to crumble. He had been stripped of everything he valued. A man like that, a man with nothing left to lose, does not go quietly into the night. He becomes a cornered animal. That evening, as Richard was locking the front door, he saw a familiar black Audi Q7 pull up across the street and kill its lights. It just sat there, a predator in the suburban dark. The real storm, he knew, hadn't passed. It was just gathering its strength for a final, desperate assault. The black Audi sat parked across the street for 2 nights, a silent, brooding presence in the quiet suburban landscape. It was a siege of one. Richard watched it from the study window, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. But Chloe, when he told her, was calm. Let him sit, she said. He's trying to decide on his next performance. On the third evening, the performance began. The doorbell rang, a polite, almost timid chime that was entirely out of character for the man who used to stride through the front door as if he owned it. Richard moved towards the hall, but Chloe put a hand on his arm. I've got this, Dad, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it held a core of steel he hadn't heard in a decade. He stepped back into the shadows of the living room archway, a silent witness. Chloe opened the door. Mark stood on the porch, a stranger in the shell of her husband. He was haggard, his usually perfect hair was unkempt, and a dark stubble shadowed his jaw. He traded his expensive suit for wrinkled jeans and a faded polo shirt. It was a carefully constructed costume of a broken man. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and pleading. Chloe, he breathed, his voice hoarse. Can I just talk to you for a minute? She didn't answer, just stepped back, leaving the door open enough for him to enter the foyer. She didn't invite him further. He was a visitor here now, and an unwelcome one at that. He stepped inside, bringing the chill of the autumn night with him. I'm so sorry, he began, the words rushing out. Chloe, I know I was a monster, an idiot. I don't know what I was thinking. The pressure, the investors, trying to keep up, I lost myself. But none of that matters. He took a step closer, his hands outstretched. What matters is you, us. I love you. I swear to you, I've never loved anyone else. We can fix this. We can start over, go away somewhere, just the two of us. He tried to take her hand. It was the centerpiece of the act, the gesture of a penitent man seeking connection. Chloe pulled her hand back, not with a jerk, but with a slow, deliberate motion. She looked at his face, at the performance of remorse, and for the first time, she saw every string, every wire. The sadness she felt was not for the man standing before her, but for the woman who would have once believed him. No, Mark, she said, her voice unnervingly calm. We can't. His pleading expression faltered. What do you mean? I'm telling you I'm sorry. I know you are, she agreed, and the calmness of her voice seemed to unnerve him more than shouting would have. But you need to understand why you're sorry. It isn't because you hurt me, and it's not because you desecrated my mother's memory. She took a small breath. You are sorry because you got caught. The words landed in the silent foyer with the force of a physical slap. She analyzed his apology with the cold precision of a diamond cutter assessing a flawed stone. You don't love me, Mark. You love what I represent. You love this house, the family name, the access it gave you. That night, you weren't just being cruel. You were trying to transfer ownership in front of everyone to solidify your claim on the assets. The only thing you are sorry for is that the asset had a failsafe you didn't know about. The mask of the broken man dissolved. His face, which had been a caricature of sorrow, hardened into something ugly and familiar. The desperation curdled into rage. Is that it? He snarled, his voice losing its hoarse whisper and regaining its arrogant bite. You're just going to throw 10 years of our life away because of one stupid party? One mistake? It wasn't one mistake, Chloe countered, her voice never rising. It was 1,000. That night was just the one I finally decided to see. Unbelievable, he spat, gesturing wildly around the foyer. This is him. This is your father. He's been whispering in your ear, poisoning you against me since the day we met. He glared past her into the shadows where he knew Richard was standing. He brainwashed you, turned you into his little puppet to get back at me. Chloe didn't even look back at her father. Her focus was entirely on Mark. She saw him now with a clarity that was both liberating and deeply sad. A hollow man, so terrified of his own insignificance that he had to diminish everyone around him to feel tall. She felt a flicker of pity for him, but it was distant, like a memory of an old ache. It no longer had the power to overwhelm her own self-worth. You need to leave now, Mark, she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, searching for one last angle, one more line that might work. He found nothing. He had run out of tactics, the game was over, and he had lost. With a final, venomous glare, he turned, wrenched the front door open, and stormed out into the night. Chloe stood for a long moment, looking at the empty doorway. Then, she reached out and pushed the heavy oak door closed. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was solid, definitive, final. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, the last barrier between her past and her future, and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 10 years. She was free. Richard stepped out of the shadows, and in the quiet of the hall, he simply stood with his daughter, ready to face the silence that came after the storm. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it did so with a gentle, determined grace. The rains washed the last of the winter grime from the world, and the sycamores lining the street unfurled their new leaves, a vibrant, almost impossibly bright green. 6 months had passed since the night of the Halloween party. 6 months of quiet, difficult, and necessary work. There had been lawyers and legal filings, the methodical untangling of a decade-long partnership. Mark's company had been forced into a messy restructuring after the truth of its fraudulent origins came to light. He had faded from their lives, a ghost in a black Audi, occasionally seen driving through a neighboring town, looking smaller and grayer than they remembered. His social world had closed its doors to him, and he was left to haunt the ruins of the life he had so arrogantly claimed as his own creation. But his downfall was no longer the focus of their days. It was just the quiet, settled dust of a demolition that had cleared the way for something new. On a bright Saturday morning in late April, Richard and Chloe were in the back garden. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine. For years, the garden had been Eleanor's exclusive domain, a right of color and life that she had cultivated with an artist's eye. After her death, Richard had maintained it, but it had felt like tending a museum. Now, it felt like a beginning. Between them, on a square of burlap, sat a young magnolia tree, its roots bald and ready for a new home. Chloe had chosen it. They had spent the morning digging a wide, deep hole in a patch of lawn that got the best of the afternoon sunday. Now, they worked together to settle the tree into the earth. There was an easy, comfortable silence between them, the kind that only exists when there's nothing left to hide. They moved in a familiar rhythm, Chloe holding the slender trunk steady, while Richard shoveled rich, dark soil around its base. It was a simple, shared task, but it felt momentous, an act of creation in a space that had been defined by memory. They were not trying to recreate what had been lost. They were planting something new, something that would grow on its own terms. As Chloe gently tamped the soil around the tree's base, she looked up at her father, a smear of dirt on her cheek. "Do you think Mom would like this magnolia tree?" she asked, her voice soft. Richard paused, leaning on his shovel. He looked at the tree, then at his daughter, her face open and free of the tension that had once been its permanent resident. He thought of Eleanor, of her pragmatism, her love of honest, beautiful things that grew from good soil. "Your mother would love anything that makes you happy, Chloe," he said, his voice warm and certain, "as long as it's planted with honesty." A genuine smile spread across Chloe's face, reaching all the way to her eyes. It was a smile he hadn't seen since she was a girl, before the world had taught her to want the wrong things. "I think so too," she said. When the tree was settled, they watered it deeply, the cool spray from the hose darkening the soil around its base. They stood back, side by side, and looked at their work. It was a small tree, barely taller than Chloe, but it stood straight and true against the blue sky. It held the promise of shade, of fragrant, waxy blossoms, of a future. The past would always be there. The scars would remain as faint silver lines, a testament to the breaks and the healing. But they were no longer a source of pain. They were part of the foundation. Richard looked at his daughter, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time, not as a reflection of him or Eleanor, but as her own person, forged in the painful fire and emerging stronger and more authentic than before. He finally felt a sense of deep, abiding peace. It wasn't the satisfaction of victory or the righteousness of justice served. It was the quiet, profound joy of seeing his daughter find her way back to herself, back to the solid ground of truth. He reached out, not to place a protective hand on her shoulder, but to simply stand beside her, two adults in the garden, ready to watch something new and beautiful grow. The house stood behind them, silent and strong, its walls finally holding what they were always meant to, a family rebuilding its life together.